to Tips of the Trade, Successful Grant Writing for Your Nonprofit. I'm here with Anne Morais. Anne has been writing successful grants for over 15 years. She has raised over $12 million to support social service, health, and education programs in Toronto and abroad. Her passion for results-based management and crafting logic models is driven by RBM. Anne's approach to grant writing is not just about raising money. Grant writing is about successful program development, clarity of mission, needs assessment, goal and outcome identification, strategic activity, work plans, and evaluation. With a Bachelor of Education, a Master's in Philosophy, and years of professional experience, Anne has the winning combination to help you advance your organization's programs into funded realities. So welcome, and thanks for joining us today and lending your wisdom on successfully writing grants.
Thank you, Natasha, for inviting me to bring my webinar to the Tamarack community. So for the next hour, we will explore the top 5 for securing grant dollars. First, the top 5 reasons why applications are rejected, then top 5 grant writing tips, and lastly, top 5 best practices for building your organization's capacity to seek and secure grants. Next slide. Top 5 reasons why funding applications are rejected. Some of you may recognize that picture. It is from a film, Terminal, starring Tom Hanks. He plays a tourist who is stuck in the New York airport and repeatedly gets his application to enter the country rejected by the immigration officer in the picture. So rejection after rejection. Next slide. Number 1, priorities are not completely aligned. Grant makers seek agencies who share the same mandate. Now, for organizations that are neither political nor religious-based, sharing mandate and values is usually not so difficult. So that one is not usually a problem. Second, grant makers seek projects or programs with the same priorities. Now, this is a key point. There are 4 areas in which a program or project alignment can be found. And I use the 4 Ps: place, population, problem, and plan. Place is the geography, and that means your area of program delivery must match the geographic priority of the grant maker. Population, the population you're serving must match the priority of the grant maker. Problem, the issue being addressed must match. And plan, the type of solution or intervention should match as well. So let me give you an example. There is a fund by RBC called RBC Youth Mental Health Project Fund. This fund has national scope, so place would work for everybody on the line. This fund supports projects serving youth. So it would be important to determine RBC's definition of youth. Sometimes youth is as young as 12 and sometimes as old as 35. So you need to make sure that the population, the youth you serve, matches their definition of youth. The problem is mental health. And again, it would be important to clarify with RBC their definition of mental health. Sometimes addiction is included and sometimes not. And if you read about the fund online, they say that the plan or the intervention must include navigation and technology. So what that means is navigation in this context means connecting youth to mental health services, and it means through some use of technology. So a solid application needs to be aligned in all these areas: place, population, problem, and plan. Tweaking or rebranding a program to fit a priority is not a good idea. It's not a good practice. We often do not tweak the place and population, but we sometimes do tweak our problem and plan. I don't advise that. Your application will be in competition with others that have full alignment. So if your program does not fit, it's not good practice to tweak. You're going to waste your time and you're going to waste the grant maker's time as well. Number 2, next slide, please. Impact is weak. So number of people served is too low, or the change is not significant enough. It is important to find out from the grant maker what kind of impact they expect. Depending on the population and intervention, the number of people affected may need to be in the tens or maybe it needs to be in the thousands. The kind of change being sought is relevant as well. Sometimes improving access to something is enough, and sometimes that's not enough, and a grant maker prefers a deeper impact like changing behavior. Impact assessed against the amount of the financial ask. Sometimes the impact is acceptable, but doesn't really make sense against the financial ask. Sometimes the ask could be too low or too high. Lacks an effective or reasonable evaluation plan to demonstrate the impact. The impact is acceptable, but maybe there's no way to assess it, or maybe it's not clear in your application how you will be assessing it. And the last one, lacks scalability or replicability. The potential for greater impact is always attractive for funders. If you can demonstrate how a program can be scaled up to impact more people, or replicated to serve a different population, it shows greater potential and makes it more desirable. Number 3, lack of organizational capacity. So what does that mean? It could be inadequate staff, inadequate number of staff, or inadequate expertise on the staff, inadequate financials. It could be the financial practices or financial stability of the organization, inadequate resources. That could include facilities, partnerships, tools, resources, inadequate experience with the community served, with the issue you're addressing, or your program model. If you feel that your application is weak in any of these areas, then it's important to address it in your application. For example, if your application is weak in expertise, then you describe your plan for recruiting the expertise that you will need for the project. And it could be something like forming an advisory committee, or recruiting a volunteer, or hiring a new staff with the right expertise. If you have inadequate experience with a particular population, maybe you want to seek a partner who does. The idea is, if you feel that you show weakness in your organizational capacity in an application, and you want to get ahead of that and address it. Number 4, questions are not answered clearly. Answers do not match the questions. Answers are unclear. Answers are repetitive. I think this is an experience we probably all have had. Application questions often seem redundant and repetitive. It is best to try to minimize the repetition in your answers. Be as clear as possible. And if you are unsure what the question is asking, you can find out from the grant maker. Ask them what they want to know about the question. Number 5, budget is inappropriate. Request is too high or too low. A request that's too large will turn a funder off, and a request that is too small will make the funder wonder if real change is actually possible. Budget items do not reflect the project. Often there's very little space to talk about your project activities. Applications usually want to know more about the impact rather than the specifics of the activities. What funders often do is they assess your activities in relation to your budget. So you have to make sure that what you describe that you're going to be doing matches how your budget is laid out. So the budget must line up with your activities. So it's not good practice to insert something in your budget that you don't mention at all in your application. Last one, math is incorrect. Because you've probably done this budget like 47 times, it's so easy to leave a mistake. So review the final numbers with a fine-tooth comb. In the old days, funders would actually take the time to, say, redo a budget. If they found a mistake, they'd send it back to you. They're doing that less and less. Grant raters are finding that if they can find an application that's polished and they don't have to spend more time on fixing it and back and forth, they'll accept that. It uses less of their own resources. So make sure all the numbers are correct. Number 6, I know this is top 5s, but this number 6 is important. The 6th reason, demand exceeds available funds. Your application is perfect, but so were other ones. So in that situation, you're going to reapply. So moving on to the top 5 grant writing tips. Tip number 1, seek try alignment. The program for which you are seeking support should align with your agency's mandate, align with the needs of your constituents, and align with the grantmaker's priorities. So we already spoke about aligning your project with the funder's priorities. You also need to seek alignment in 2 other areas. Your project must align with your constituents' needs. I can't tell you how many times I've gone into organizations, and when they talk about the grant that they want to apply to, they talk about their needs, what the organization needs. And I say, well, the funder doesn't actually care about your needs. We need to start thinking about your constituents' needs. Articulate what they need, not what the organization needs. And the next one is to align with your agency mandate. Now, I know that may seem obvious. Of course, you're not going to deliver a program that doesn't align in your agency's mandate, but that happens a lot. And there's actually the term mission creep. It is important to ensure that you don't have mission creep, that you stay within your mandate. Tip number 2. Stellar programming. Your program has clear objectives and outcomes. Your objectives and outcomes address the need or problem. You have outcome measurements, and activities are relevant and realistic. What this really means is that you have a well-developed program. You can have the greatest grant writer on staff, but if your program is not well planned, it's not going to be funded. I like to use a specific tool to develop programs, and I call that, I use the logic model framework, and some of you may be familiar with that. There are other frameworks out there as well. I use logic model and results-based management tool to develop a program so that we can clearly identify the objectives and the outcomes, so we can make sure they match the need. We have an evaluation plan to measure it, and the activities are the best activities to bring about those outcomes. So tip number 3. Tip number 3, concise, consistent, collaborative writing style. This is going to be in 3 different slides. Being concise, less is more, especially nowadays where a lot of applications have strict word counts. Words need to reflect clarity in thought. Write for a generalist and not an expert reader. Often funders are specialists in their priority area, and they know what's happening in the community, but you actually don't know who's reading the applications. Sometimes it's a committee of volunteers, and these volunteers could have a range of knowledge and a range of expertise. So make sure that what you write, anyone can understand. Minimize potential for thought drift. You don't want to lose the reader. Do not introduce an idea that can take the reader off course. If an idea is essential and could take the reader off course, go with them. Address it in your text and bring the reader back. Actually, sometimes that works really well, because if you introduced an idea that took the reader off course, they think about something, and in the next line, when you address what they thought about, it boosts their ego. They feel that like they know what you're going to say before you say it, and that always makes a reader feel good. So if you can actually take them off course and go with it and bring them back, it works well in your application. Minimize the number of ideas in one paragraph. The work you do is second nature to you. It all makes sense. You understand it perfectly, but the reader does not. So you have to be as simple and clear as possible in each paragraph. Try not to say too much. Minimize weak verb statements. So you will, instead of saying we will do we aim to do something, say we will. Of course, you may not be able to, and that's what evaluation is about, but the idea is that you will do something. You're not just going to try to do something. Next, consistent. When I say consistent, I mean try to keep a consistent tone between your organization, your project, and the funder. So that's what I mean by the word consistent. So you're going to incorporate Grantmaker language and vocabulary into your text. You're going to use their words, use their vernacular. Avoid switching between similar words. For example, if you're talking about your clients, in the next paragraph you call them participants, in the next paragraph you call them service users, Sometimes we do that to break up the monotony of using the same word over and over again. The problem is it confuses the reader. They think maybe it's different groups. They're not really sure because you're using different words. So you want to maintain some sort of consistency to make it easier for the reader to understand. Remain in the same scope of analysis as much as possible. Sometimes when we try to detail how a problem affects a community, we start with maybe a big analysis and then we bring it down to the individual level or family level or community level. And then sometimes what we do is we end up jumping around between these different levels. It's confusing for the reader. So my recommendation is you can start big, bring it down to the level that's most relevant for your organization, and then stay in that level as much as possible. Maintain consistency of approach and ideas among all your proposals for the same program. The Grantmaker community in Canada is actually quite small. Sometimes they speak to each other, and they may even share proposals. So a consistent approach across all your proposals shows strength in your program. Next slide, collaborative. Minimize exclusive terminology. What I mean by exclusive terminology are expressions that set you apart from everyone else. Sometimes I've seen proposal expressions like, we are the only organization who, or we are the first organization. Now, in your attempt to show your uniqueness, you run the risk of setting yourself apart from everyone else, which is actually what you don't want to do. You want to create a tone of collaboration. You want to create a tone of collaboration with the funder. You want to give them a sense that you guys are in this together. So you don't want to set yourself apart. And then for some applications, you also want to create a tone of collaboration with the community you're serving. So you're not outside your constituents. You work with your constituents. And then there's the other kind of collaboration, which is working with other organizations. But the idea is you don't want to set yourself apart. You want to put your organization as in collaboration with everybody. But at the same time, you still want to demonstrate why your organization is well positioned and equipped and ready to carry out the project. But you don't want to use terms that create a sense of exclusivity. You want to use terms that create a sense of expertise, working together, those kinds of words. If possible, include a connection to a current event. Ground your project in a current event. It creates a sense of collaboration with what is relevant and in the news. And it also helps the reader to visualize or place what you are describing. Like an individual donor, grant makers want to feel good, empowered, and confirmed about supporting your program. They don't want to feel sad. They don't want to feel guilty or lacking. So sometimes when we're describing the problem, we may use accusatory or catastrophic language. That's going to make the reader feel bad. No one wants to feel bad. Proposals need to make the readers believe in the problem and then believe that your organization can solve the problem. So I'm not suggesting you minimize the problem, just choose words that lead to a sense of hope rather than a sense of despair. Incorporate Grantmaker language and vocabulary. I said this in a slide before, and I'm saying it again. Using Grantmaker language is good for creating a tone of consistency, and it's also good for creating a tone of collaboration. Next slide, tip number 4, partnerships. Partnerships are useful to fill a gap in knowledge, program delivery capacity, say evaluation expertise, or resources. You can find partners across all sectors. That includes for-profits, government, whomever. When partnerships are mandatory, and even when they are not, they speak volumes about an organization. They strengthen your application by showing sector knowledge. They show a self-awareness. You understand where your organization has gaps and where you need to partner with another organization to fill that gap. And they demonstrate collaboration skills, which are all excellent things to demonstrate. Tip number 5, budgets. Make it real, reflective of the narrative, including the partnership. If a grant is capped at $100,000 Every project submitted all cost $100,000 regardless of the project. That's what funders always say happens. Gone are the days when they would accept that. And actually, like I said before, they don't really want to spend the time negotiating a new budget. Now they say they really want to see real budgets. And I've seen some grant makers actually not indicate the maximum amount because they say they don't want that to influence the budget. They want to see a real budget that reflects the activities of what you're doing. So the best, like I said before, is to craft a real budget that's aligned with the activities you described in your narrative. And if it's a collaborative application, then there is an expectation that all members of the collaborative will be reimbursed for their contributions to the project. So if you say someone's a partner, but that partnership is not reflected in the budget, it doesn't show such a strong partnership. It's always good to reflect the partnership in the budget. But make it worthwhile for you and cost effective for the grant maker. So do not try to make the application more appealing by lowballing the expensive. That would actually put a strain on your organization. And at the same time, also don't pad the numbers to help support other expenses of the organization. We know core funding is such a challenge these days, and we need to use these project-based to support our core activity. But the budget has to make sense for the project. The actual goal is to try to find that sweet spot to make it worthwhile for you and cost-effective for the grant maker. Ensure the math is right. Like I said before, you're going to double check all your numbers to make sure there are no mistakes in the final budget. Now, math isn't only in the final budget. Math also comes up with when you're calculating, say, the number of workshops you're delivering and then how many people are going to be at those workshops. And then you need to calculate how many people over a year, over 6 months, and you have all these different calculations. Make sure all the math is right, not just the math in the budget. Last one, follow the budget guidelines. Most grant makers publish their budget guidelines. You are going to read so you understand what eligible expenses are, and don't wait to the end. And then you find out that, say, staffing is not an eligible expense after you've written an entire proposal, which you need staff to deliver, but yet that's not an eligible expense. You want to find it at the beginning. You want to see what their definition of administration is, and if they allow you to include administration costs into your budget. You want to find out their definition of in-kind. In-kind can mean many different things. You want to find out if there's a cost share requirement, if, say, they only will pay for a portion of a project and you have to make up the rest, and the rest that you make up, say, you only have government funding. Sometimes they have stacking rules saying that if they're, say, a provincial funder doesn't want the cost sharing being supported by another provincial department, say it has to be maybe a non-government funder or a different level of government. So you have to find out what the budget guidelines are. Now, I recommend that it's always a good idea to, and you'll see in the next slide, to connect with a grant maker, kind of find out from them a little bit more. This is a place that you can always ask them questions. You'll always have budget questions. They'll publish their guidelines, but sometimes it's not so clear what something's on, especially in context of your own budget. So take the opportunity to speak to them and clarify any concerns you have around the budget. So that's the top 5 tips. Moving to the next slide. 5 best practices for building your organization's capacity to seek and secure grants. Number 1, team effort. Grant seeking and writing is a team effort. It should not be a single person's responsibility. It actually requires the expertise and input of an entire team. Fundraisers understand their marketing and writing. Program delivery staff understand the program and evaluation. Finance understand the budget. Admin understands the stack of supporting documents required, and all the staff actually need to keep their ear to the ground to learn of upcoming grant opportunities and deadlines. The other key team member is the proofreader, who is unfamiliar with the program or project. It's quite important to recruit someone who knows very little about the issue and program to gauge the clarity of the application. That could be a staff in another department, or it could be a volunteer. So they can serve as a proofreader. Remember, applications need to be written for generalists. Number 2, insource your research. This is not a task that should be outsourced. If you pay a company or recruit a volunteer to develop a list of potential funding opportunities, that list is only as good as the day it is created. While many foundations and government funds have been consistent over the years, new funds are always emerging. The key is to become familiar with the landscape. While the landscape is always changing, the Canadian funding landscape is actually not that big. So I recommend that you invest some time in becoming familiar with potential sources. Identify relevant government bodies. Register with their listservs, which is how many government departments and ministries announce upcoming deadlines. There are a number of funder databases out there that you can purchase. Some are quite costly and others are more affordable. But remember this, they get their information from CRA, which is public. So you have access to primary information just like them. However, what they offer is the ability to search through that information. So I tend to use the CRA website all the time. That's where I get my information of which foundation is giving to whom and how much. So from my experiences, these databases are useful, and they're more useful for foundations and corporations, but not particularly useful for government grants. Government grants are coming out all the time, so they need to stay on top of it just like everybody else. And the other thing I find when I've compared these different databases, that none of them are complete because it is a changing landscape. You can't expect those databases to be complete. So the best strategy is to invest time. I'd say allocate maybe 4 hours a month to search websites, government websites, and databases. Sign up for listservs and mailing lists. The particular mailing lists that are useful are a mailing list from Charity Village, Imagine Canada's Grant Seeker Monthly, and Hillborn Charity News. Those 3 mailing lists have a lot of useful information around upcoming deadlines. Actually, there were 2 previously submitted questions on this topic, so I can see this is quite important for most people. The first question is it worth spending large sums of money to get access to a foundation funding database? So my short answer is no. I think it is worth the time to invest in getting familiar with the funding landscape, which can be done through web searches, listservs, and annual reports of similar organizations. On the other hand, if you do have the funds and you know you will spend time on that database, it may be worth it. But if you do purchase a database, don't get a volunteer or transient staff to use that database because you're going to be missing the opportunity to build the knowledge in-house. Alternatively, Imagine Canada's database called Grant Connect is available free in libraries across Canada, but not all libraries. You need to call Imagine Canada and ask them which library closest to you has free access. So if you decide to dedicate 4 hours a month, that could be, once every 5 months you can go to the library and look through Grant Connect. That's the database I use. I would say it's the most clunky, but it's a good place to start. The second question is, how do we keep up on grants before finding out a week before they do? Now that question is especially relevant for government grants, where there seems to be less and less time between announcement and deadline. As previously said, get to know government ministries and departments that are relevant for you and stay on top of them. Sometimes it takes some searching on their websites, but you can usually find a listserv sign up. Foundations and corporations tend to maintain deadlines from year to year, so you can get to know their schedule. The other option is I actually maintain a Twitter account where I list upcoming grant deadlines. And you can see it's on the bottom of the screen. My hashtag is AppDue, as in application due, so APPDU. And if you search that hashtag, you can scroll through and become familiar with the range of grants. I usually post a grant maybe 4 or 5 weeks before a deadline. And if you don't have Twitter and you still want to see it, you can go to my website. On the homepage, I publish, say, the 5 most recent tweets that I've put out. It's on the front page, on the homepage of my website. So, next tip, number 3, strategic selection. Select grants that meet the criteria of tri-alignment. Select grants with deadlines that are manageable. Ensure you have sufficient time and staff involvement to write the grant. Resist the carpet bomb method. Now, the carpet bomb method is when you send your proposal out to so many foundations and government bodies and hope 1 or 2 will respond with interest. I don't recommend this. It's kind of an old-fashioned strategy. It's not a good use of your resources and time. And again, it doesn't create a strategic, consistent image of your organization. The best is to hone in, identify funds that you meet the criteria of tri-alignment and pursue them. Allocate the right amount of time so you can craft clear and concise narrative to pursue that funding. Number 4, next slide. Connect with the grant maker. It's important to connect for a number of reasons. First, connecting allows you to clarify and expand on grant makers' priorities. While they will publish their priorities, you can usually seek out more specific preferences when you're in conversation with them, especially around the plan. Remember I said there were 4 P's? I said that before. I said place, population, problem, plan. They often publish the place and the population and the problem, but not necessarily the plan. You may not know what elements of the intervention they're interested in. So it's a great opportunity to find out from them. It's always useful to develop a relationship with a grant maker, so begin it with a phone call. Now, I do not believe that if you can have a good relationship with them and they get to know you and they like you, that they're going to give you funding just because of that. Your project has to be the right project. So a relationship is not like with an individual donor. You're going to develop a relationship, and that's how you're going to increase your gifts. It's different with grant makers. It's really about your program. But developing a relationship helps you get there, helps you clarify what you're doing, helps clarify to you what they want to do. Now, because grant makers are always in search of the best program to address their priorities, they are actually an excellent resource. They love to matchmake. So use them as a resource to learn more about the sector. If you want to know if there's another agency out there doing something similar and you're not really sure where to look and who, grant makers often know that, and they'll tell you. So it's great to have a conversation with them about that. You also want to listen to their questions and their vocabulary. It's a window into their preferences. What they ask you, that's what's meaningful and important to them. My last recommendation is have 2 staff on the phone call. It's really rare that you're going to get a face-to-face. No one does that anymore. But you should be able to schedule a phone call, especially if it's a government grant. Sometimes a foundation staff as well. So when you have 2 people on the staff, you will be surprised at the different things each of you hear. Number 5, information management. Collecting and attaching supporting documents to application is an administrative mission. Avoid scrambling last minute and redoing the process for each application. And in the event that your application is approved, you really need to be organized to ensure that you deliver the program on time as the way you described it and that you fulfill reporting requirements. So ensure easy access to up-to-date organizational documents, evidence, statistics, support letters, financials, and references. To maintain consistency across applications, Draft primer documents. And so, lastly, select a grant management tool or information management system that works best for your organization. There you go. There's the top 5. So I hope that was useful for everybody.
That's
Natasha?
wonderful. Thanks, Amy. Thanks. Yeah, those are fantastic tips. I know I can definitely, I really appreciated some at the beginning with looking at how we're really tailoring our language and how we're describing the program rather than actually tweaking our programs or changing our programs to fit what we think the funders want to, what the funders are looking to fund, and how we can be true to our own mandates and find funders who are looking to fund those mandates. I know I have to admit I've been involved with previous nonprofits where we submitted a grant, you know, that was pretty standard, that hit all of the goals that we were aiming to achieve in the city and in the place where we were reforesting parts of this desert land. And you know, we went back and forth a couple of times with the funders because you know, we try to do our best to accommodate, especially private companies sometimes have a couple of different requests. And they, you know, couldn't go to one place, so we decided to do it in the city and host an event there for them. And then they thought animals were better than plants, and we went back and forth a couple of times, and in the end we ended up with this grant that was essentially a zoo visit. And it wasn't at all what we had in mind, and it didn't really help our organization. It didn't impact any of the communities that we were trying to impact, and in the end it wouldn't really have served anything the organization was trying to do either. So I think what you were getting at there, in terms of alignment and tweaking how we write about this and not about what the program is, I think those really fantastic tips. So thank you. So that brings us into the question portion of the webinar. We had a couple of questions submitted beforehand, so Anne, you actually already answered a couple of them, but we had another one submitted from Edmonton, and the person over there was asking, how much detail and an embellishment would you put on a proposal?
So my short answer is as little as possible. Best to make your proposal as concise and succinct as possible. There are a few areas I do emphasize with detail and supporting evidence. So the 3 areas are the need or problem statement. For me, I spend the most time on that and make sure that it has the perfect combination of information in that. The impact that your intervention is going to bring about. Specifically how and why your intervention will bring about the change you are seeking. And then the 3rd area is a demonstration of your organization's capacity. Put some detail in that. Now, it's also important to note whom you're applying. Governments and some foundations look for concise applications, but corporations, service clubs like Rotary, things like that, and smaller family foundations, they respond much better to personal stories. More like sending an application to them is more like fundraising from individuals. So think about who you're sending it to and think about being concise and succinct.
Great, and we actually have quite a few questions coming through the questions box, so we'll go through those. If you do have any questions, again, please feel free to type them in, and we'll do our best to get to everyone's questions. So the first one that we have here was from David, and he was just asking if the number, I think number 6, that you were talking about in your first reasons why grants are rejected. Number 6 was reapply. And so he was asking, how much should we change the application, or do we save the energy and send in the same answers and the budget again?
So if your application was not accepted, and you can speak to them afterwards and find out why, and they'll tell you, oh, it was great, we loved it, but we had too many applications. The 2 questions then is, can we apply again? And how do you suggest we make that better? Ask them how to be improved. If they don't give you anything, then you don't need to change it. If they give you some ideas, even the questions that they ask you, well, what do you think about that? Those are probably areas that they focus on. So take the cues from them.
Great, and I think that almost helps to answer one of the questions that just came into from Russ, who was asking if you're not successful with a grant, is it a good idea to request a follow-up call to understand how to improve for next time?
Yes. So if it's government, there should be someone there. If it's a foundation, you may not be able to get anyone on the phone. If you can, that's great. But for example, say the Canada Post has a foundation, and the Bell Mental Health Fund, they don't give feedback, and it's not because they don't want to. They don't have the manpower. Especially if it's a foundation connected to a corporation, the people who work on it are usually their regular staff who have a job, and they volunteer to be on the foundation committee. So they don't have a slew of people sitting on the phone providing feedback. They just don't have the capacity to do it. So if they say they don't give feedback, it's usually because they can't. But if it's a government, then you can find somebody and get that information from them.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. And then we had another question from David asking, when you make an application that stresses partnerships, how detailed would you suggest including that partnership? Like, would you have a full memorandum of understanding, or?
No. With respect to attachments, I only like to attach what they want. Don't think the more is better. If they don't ask for the memorandum of understanding, do not include it. Highlight all the strengths of the different partners and why those strengths work well together. That's what's going to sell them on your partnership.
Great. And then we had a couple of questions about this one. Do you have any recommendations or examples of grant management tools?
I don't. I just use basic Excel, and I know there's a lot of them out there, and I don't know much about that kind of stuff. There is a company that's developed a free one, and I tried to use it, but it doesn't work on Mac-based computers, so it didn't work on my computer. And I didn't have time to make it work, or patience to make it work. But it's whatever tools your organization use, however the information is managed in your organization, think about the information for grants. Make a kind of dedicate a piece of that for grant management information.
Great. And then there was one more question just about, I know a lot of people are asking if we're going to be sending out the slides and the presentation after this, and we definitely are. You'll get the recording and the presentation slides in just a couple of days. And so if you do have any more questions, please feel free to type them in through the questions box. And I have a couple of my own that I was thinking of while you were talking. So the first one, I think you mentioned a couple of times, Canada actually has a really small foundation community. So you touched a little bit on some of the language that we use, but a lot of it, what we talked about, was writing style. So I'm just wondering, in your experience with the foundations in Canada, can you speak to any of the suggested language that you find most helpful or most successful in grants?
It's using their language.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then it's just being simple. I try to use very little jargon, because I'm writing it for a generalist. Minimize the jargon, make it so that anyone understands, and make it so that anyone feels that they can get on board. So the big thing is that because I don't work with one particular theme. I do international development, and I do health research, and I write grants on any topics, of which I'm not an expert on anything. So I don't, So I get the information from the organization, which sometimes doesn't mean anything to me. It's so jargony, it's so within their sector and in their area, and then I have to make it so everyone understands. So those are the two recommendations for language.
So in general, how many conversations would you suggest having back and forth? Is it just that kind of one initial phone call, or would you suggest follow-up calls, or how do you expand that relationship?
With the Grantmaker?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, so you're going to have one. You will have one at the beginning, hopefully you'll write it through. As you're writing it, some questions will come up. If you're lucky, so you have a second conversation before it's due, you're probably not going to have more than 2. You'll submit it, and then you want to follow up afterwards. You get it or you don't get it, you want to follow up. So you'll probably end up having 3.
That's great. And I'm just thinking, so some of the people on the line and a lot of the people that we work with are they're conveners of small poverty reduction initiatives sometimes, and a lot of the time they have very limited capacity. So, 3 phone calls and 4 hours of research a month and all that kind of stuff, that adds up to a lot of capacity. So do you have any recommendations for small organizations who are struggling with maybe even no staff, with just a board who does this on a voluntary basis off the side of their desk through work, or just people who are kind of essentially struggling with writing grants for their own position and might not have enough time for the extra 4 hours a month or the extra developing Excel tables and that kind of thing? How do we stop that tail chasing?
Yeah, that's a tough question, right? How do you make more time in the day? How do you do it properly? So sometimes success kind of breeds motivation. So instead of saying, okay, I need to be on top of it all, I need to find one that's bang on. That's the right fund for me, and that's where I'm going to spend my time. I found that if I spent weeks on the same application, chances are I was more successful than when I spent the last 2 days on it, scrambling at the end, writing about it. So focus on one. Try to get that success with one. And you'll see the success will serve as kind of a motivation and a confidence building. So that you can say, okay, so now I can look at it and spend a little bit more time, maybe take that same application and tweak it, write it for a different grant. You're not rewriting it every single time. You're using, because you're, say, applying for the same program, so there has to be consistency across your applications. So the next time you do it should be a little bit easier and a little bit easier. So I don't know if that's helpful, but try to go for success at first.
Right, but I think that's good. Building off of what you've already done, and not reinventing anything, but slowly building capacity that way from what you're trying.
Right.
And then just any tips on the types of evaluation funders are looking for, just in general. Have you experienced any that get more positive reaction, or are there certain elements that funders are sometimes looking to see expressed in the grant regarding evaluation?
So usually my recommendation is that it's too overwhelming to develop a full evaluation plan when you're just submitting an application. You don't even know if you're going to get the funding. Are you going to spend the time kind of really understanding the evaluation? You have to get a sense of the big questions. What are your outcomes? And you need to measure those outcomes. So there needs to be something said about your plan for figuring that out. So it may be allocating some dollars in the budget to hiring an evaluation consultant. So you can say you're going to do that. That's all you need to say in the application, that you want to make sure that you've reached these outcomes that you say you're going to reach. There's a couple different ways that you can do it, but you don't know exactly, depending on how the project rolls out, and that you're going to hire a consultant. And sometimes you just need to say your plan for doing evaluation, not the evaluation itself. I find it's too overwhelming at the application development stage to get into the details about the evaluation.
Right, so again, that idea of addressing your weaknesses.
Right.
If evaluation is not what you have, right? Addressing your weaknesses and even building that into the grant, I think, was a great point that you made. You don't have to have that capacity already, but that can be part of what you're getting funded for.
Right, right. And it could be something like you're going to, spend some time on attending some evaluation learning circles, or do some research to identify the right consultant to hire. Just kind of a little bit about what you're going to do to make sure that you have a good evaluation plan.
And actually, I think Russ was just reading my mind because as we're talking about this, I'm thinking back to the logic models and the results-based management tools that you were talking about. So are you able to speak about those tools further? Russ was specifically asking about logic models, and do you do this as a team? Because you mentioned before too that everybody should be involved in this process.
Yes, especially program delivery staff need to be the logic models. So actually, that's one of my workshops. I do a day learning on logic models. What is a logic model? Why is it useful? What are the different parts? And what do you need to get out of it to make sure that your program is well planned? So if you have the opportunity to spend some time on learning a logic model, it will end up being a very useful tool. So what the logic model does, it's similar to a theory of change, although theory of change really emphasizes why a certain intervention will bring about a certain change, and then why that certain change will bring about another level of change, kind of like the connecting the changes. The logic model doesn't emphasize that as much as a theory of change. The logic model is a little bit more of a roadmap of that. It identifies, it lays out your mandate, it lays out your objectives, and it helps you identify the specific outcomes of your project. So an objective is what you want to accomplish, and an outcome is what's going to happen because of your project that proves your objective is being reached. So in my day training, I kind of we break that apart and we look at all those different parts of a program to help people identify the specific outcomes. And for a lot of, especially federal applications, they're going to ask for short-term and mid-term and long-term outcomes. I don't know if that's familiar with everybody. I kind of say, think about like a shorter term and mid-term. Think about 2 levels of outcomes, and I go through different sort of ways you can think about that. So you can assume that you can have different levels of outcomes, and all those outcomes are going to lead to the achievement of an objective, a change that you're seeking. So a logic model helps you identify all that. And then it takes it a little bit to the more practical level, where it says, okay, if that's the outcomes you're going to do, what are your interventions? What are your actual activities? And what resources do you need to bring about those activities, to bring about those outcomes?
Yeah,
that's in a nutshell. There's a logic model.
I've had experiences a couple of times with the logic models. I wonder, do you have any templates that you would be able to offer in the follow-up? I wonder if we might be able to send around like a file or a link or something for people if they wanted to check them out.
Yeah, I mean, I have ones that I use, and I focus on the impact chain, the thing from kind of goal, objective to outcomes. I like to really hash that out of a program, and then I spend less time on the specific activities and resources that you need, because I find that's much easier for organizations to figure out on their own. I mean, I can give you the template I use, but it's not so useful if you've never done it before, right? Or if you haven't had experience, or
not complete with the training.
Yeah, it's not going to help you. I recommend, if you can do a day training, my next logic model workshop's in December. I know they're only in Toronto, and so a lot of you folks aren't in Toronto, but if you can do some learning around logic models, that'll be helpful.
Great. And looking at the time, we're actually just about to get into our closing announcements and show people some of those other workshops that are coming up. I wonder if you have 30 seconds to speak to Elena's question about, do you have any suggestions for a database for international foundations that would fund NGOs abroad?
Well, some of the international ones are on the Canadian databases. There's a couple American ones, and I don't know them offhand. And some of them are even free, the American-based ones. But I'm going to have to, can I email the names of those databases, because I can't remember offhand any of them.
Yeah, let's do that. We'll send a follow-up email with the presentation slides and the recording, and we'll include that as well.
Okay.
Perfect. So thank you so much. We're just a couple of minutes to 1 o'clock Eastern time, so we're going to move on to announcements. I want to thank you again, Anne, for being part of today's broadcast and sharing your grant seeking wisdom with us, and for everyone who was on the call today for your thoughtful questions. For more information, and Allison, if you want to go to the next slide, for more information about poverty reduction, you're invited to subscribe to Vibrant Communities' monthly newsletter, Cities Connect, and join Vibrant Communities' online learning community for poverty reduction practitioners. The links are there on the screen, and we can send them to you in the follow-up as well. Allison, if you go to the next slide, if you enjoyed today's webinar, you might also be interested in our Evaluating Community Impacts that's coming to Hamilton, Ontario, November 15th to 17th. This 3-day event features our own Liz Weaver and evaluation guru Mark Kabaj. You'll learn foundational ideas for evaluating community change, key principles for assessing community change, receiving evaluation planning tools and outcome evaluation tools such as most significant change, outcome mapping, ripple effect monitoring, and more. So this is for anybody with programs that need to be evaluated, those who are part of a collaborative and are seeking to understand how to evaluate the initiative, or just if evaluation is part of your job. If you go on to the next slide, I told you we would let you know about Anne's upcoming workshops. There they are. So you can tap into Anne's knowledge on grant writing in these upcoming fall workshops in Toronto. There's Grant Seeking 101, Proposal Writing from Reluctance to Reward, and Learning Logic Models, December 15th. So if you go to the last slide, in a few days you'll receive our email with a link to the audio recording and the presentation slides. You can email me at natasha@tamaractcommunity.ca if you'd like to provide feedback about today's webinar. So thank you again for joining us, and have a great day, everyone.